thank you for joining the BSHR for our first speaker event of the term. To introduce myself again, I am Callista Chong, the chairperson of the Broad Street Humanities Review, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by our esteemed guest, Professor David Armitage. So just a bit more about the Broad Street Humanities Review. We are founded in 2019, and we are the University of Oxford's very first student-run undergraduate humanities journal, which aims to invigorate interdisciplinary academic writing in our student community and beyond. So this term, we are thrilled to introduce a variety of panels that center on the theme time through different disciplinary lenses. And in addition to hosting interesting discussions, we produce termly journal issues with the support of a talented team of writers and editors. So as I said earlier, we are now calling for pitches and editor applications for our winter issue on the theme time, and more details can be found on the Zoom chat or on our social media platforms. And now please allow me to introduce our esteemed guest, Professor David Armitage. So David is the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History at Harvard University and an affiliated faculty member at Harvard Law School. A prize-winning writer and teacher, he's the author or editor of 18 books and has held visiting positions in the US, the UK, Australia, China, France, Germany, and South Korea, and is currently an honorary fellow of St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, and an honorary professor of history at both Queen's University, Belfast, and the University of Sydney. So now on to the format of today's event. So Professor Armitage will be presenting his insights on today's theme, Can the Past Present the Future? Following which we will move into a moderated Q&A segment with the audience. So you're very welcome to submit your questions for Professor Armitage in the chat, which I will read aloud on your behalf. Alternatively, you may also choose to unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you'd like to ask the question yourself, but please be reminded that this session will be recorded, and if you're not comfortable with that, you can choose to keep your camera off as well. So now that all the logistical details have been accounted for, Professor Armitage, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Callista. Thank you to you, to Jamie, to the other editors and writers of this exciting new review for this opportunity to come to Oxford, albeit virtually. I would be very happy indeed to be physically in Oxford, but this is the next best thing, and it's very good to see such an attentive audience here. So my theme for today, as Callista has already mentioned, is to at least begin to start answering the question, can the past present the future? And you'll see a pun there, present or present, and I'll talk about the relationship between the past, the present, and the future. This is a theme that relates to some of my earlier writing, especially the History Manifesto that I co-authored with Professor Joe Gouldy, who I believe will be joining another event for the Humanities Review quite shortly. But I want in particular to talk about the place of history in relation to the present and how the relationship between history and the present can help us to think about the future. So sharing my screen as I am, what I want to do today is to address this precise question, can the past present the future? Now, as a historian, my first instinct might be to reply to that question in the words of the leading Scottish historian Tom Devine, the future is not my period. And that would be the response, I think, of most professional historians. Of course, historians have no better track record on predicting the future or projecting into the future than anybody else. And as I'll show in a moment, professional historians have been rigorously programmed to prevent themselves, even if they might have the urge, to speculate about the future, to acknowledge that they have anything to say about the future, as that quote from Tom Devine I just gave you hints, or that we might have any responsibility, either professionally or indeed ethically, to address the future. I think, and an increasing number of other historians think, that self-denying ordinance to have anything to say as an historian about the future is destructive. Destructive of our discipline, destructive of the importance of what our discipline can teach the present, and also destructive ethically in the sense that historians, along with other scholars, we're not alone in this obviously, but along with other scholars, should be helping us to orient ourselves towards the future with our knowledge of the past. So why might this particular topic, the past's relationship to the future, be relevant to a historian like me? I come, as I say, from a profession which has a very strong bias against any relationship with the future, at least in our public and professional roles. We can do this, as it were, privately, but not in our roles as historians. So in order to help us think about why historians and why history might have something to say to the present about the future, let me begin with a historical encounter, a recent historical encounter, when two worlds met in Bloomsbury in London. In 2014, two Hawaiian women traveled from Hawaii to London and found their own past confronting them vividly in the present. At the British Museum, these two women, Mala Andrade and Noel Kahanu, had the opportunity to see 5 Hawaiian images of feathered war gods. Here are 2 of them from the British Museum. War gods, Hawaiian war gods, known as Akua Hulu Manu. These 5 war gods, including the pair that you can see here on the screen, had been given to Captain James Cook in 1779, when Cook visited Hawaii on his last and, of course, his fatal voyage of exploration there. Kahanu, one of the 2 women, declined to visit the gods at the British Museum, but her companion, Mala Andrade, later described the overwhelming effect the meeting with her Hawaiian war gods had upon her. And here I quote her account of that meeting. What I experienced upon seeing these gods was a profound sense, not of my looking at them, but of them looking at me. It was as if they were asking me, who are you? Why are we here? What are you going to do about it? To be in the presence of sacred objects, she continued, created at a time so very different from our own, is to ask ourselves, how have we changed? Under their gaze, we are compelled to ask ourselves, are we doing enough for our family, our ancestors, our community, our nation? I feel such sentiments, again, this is Andrade speaking, I feel such sentiments emanating from these ancestral works, as though each was an elder who watches your behavior with a set of expectations that we need to rise to individually and collectively. 2 of these Hawaiian gods, the ones you see here on the screen, were more recently displayed for a wider audience at London's Royal Academy of Arts on the Strand in a 2018 exhibition held to mark the 250th anniversary of Cook's first expedition. That's where I saw them a couple of years ago. The remarkable force of these images was palpable there, even to non-Hawaiians like me. As the exhibition catalogue at the time noted, their power, when confronted in an exhibition, remains unabated and brings the past dramatically into the present, Now, few traces of the human past are perhaps as charismatic as these Hawaiian war gods, and most of us at least cannot feel quite so direct an ancestral connection with its traces as those Hawaiian visitors to the British Museum. Even Kahanu's resistance to meeting the Hawaiian war gods there was evidence, I think, of their spiritual force and of the force they carried from the past into the present. Nonetheless, an encounter such as this does indicate just how strikingly the past can erupt into the present and intervene into our current concerns. And also, crucially, it reminds us that it's only in the present that the past can make any claim upon us at all. It does so with an accompanying ethical challenge, as Andrade put it, a set of expectations we need to rise to individually and collectively that points towards the future. So the challenge of the past in the present, posing these questions, what are we going to do? What do we do? What have we done? What are we doing? What might we do collectively, individually, nationally? Point towards the future. That is the challenge of the past and the present, orienting us towards the future. Now, to many historians, I would confess, this attitude, hearing the past in the present, using it to point towards the future, that attitude would seem like a breach of our professional creed. And that creed's commitment to separating the concerns of the present from a scholarly or scientific treatment of the past. Historians are brought up to believe that the past does not speak to us. We speak for the past, nor does the past look at us. We examine the past, we look at it. It does not look at us, unlike these war gods. Historians, we think, or we tell ourselves at least, control the interpretation of the past, but the past cannot control us. And because the past does not confront us in the way that, for example, Andrade found the Akua Hulumanu staring at her, the past does not ask us as historians if we are fulfilling our duties to our family, to our ancestors, to our community, to our nation. The past, in this sense, is held to make no claim on us in the present, let alone towards the future. Now, the name that historians give to the sin of assuming that the past has any relevance to the present, or the present any force in shaping our sense of the past, the name we give to that sin is presentism. Presentism is a very slippery term, as I'll describe in the next few moments. Indeed, it's been defined by the current chair of the Cambridge history faculty, the eminent early modern historian Alexandra Walsham, as, quotes, a term of abuse conventionally deployed to describe an interpretation of history that's biased towards and colored by present day concerns, preoccupations, and values. We might say, imitating Jane Austen, that it's a truth almost universally acknowledged among historians that an aversion to presentism remains, and again I'm quoting Alex Walsham here, remains one of the yardsticks against which we as historians continue to define what we do in our professional capacities. Indeed, for most professional historians today, presentism is rather like St. Augustine's famous definition of time in his autobiographical Confessions. If nobody asks historians what presentism means, they know what it is. If you ask historians to explain what presentism is, however, they don't, and their reaction to presentism is deeply confused. I've counted, in fact, something like 17 different conceptions or definitions of presentism used by historians. The one thing those definitions all have in common is that historians, or most professional historians, say that they are against it. In this sense, historians are like Marx, that is, not Karl Marx, but Groucho Marx. In his 1931 film, Horse Feathers, Groucho Marx leads a chorus of the song, Whatever It Is, I'm Against It. Unfortunately, my technological skills don't allow me to play the clip, but you can find it easily on YouTube, well worth watching. This particular Marxist interpretation of history. Whatever it is, I'm against it. And that is the creed of professional historians against presentism. They have no idea necessarily what it is, but they know perfectly well that they are against it. I won't go through all 17 definitions. You would be gnawing your arms in frustration and tedium if I tried that. But let me just define a few of the different ways in which presentism has been described by historians. The first is presentism against any idea of teleology, the idea that is a narrative coherence between the past, the present, and the future, which is a narrative of progress. This is often called the Whig interpretation of history. I emphasize the H there. This has nothing to do with hairdos. It is the Whig, W-H-I-G, interpretation of history as famously defined by Herbert Butterfield, a British historian in the 1930s. This is the tendency, as Butterfield put it, to emphasize certain principles of progress in the past and to produce a story which is the ratification, if not in fact the glorification of the present. This is presentism as the past being only a prelude to the present, the best aspects from the past being selected out almost by a kind of Darwinian process of evolution to produce our wonderful and glorious present. Always with a positive plus sign alongside it, never a negative one. There have been important efforts more recently to think about how the present has been produced by the past, also in its negative aspects as well, not a glorification or ratification of the past, but an analysis of how the past has led to the present in terms of various kinds of stratification, hierarchy, oppression, domination, and inequality, for instance. All of these are aspects which, of course, are also precipitated out of the past into the present, and a kind of reverse Whig interpretation of history, maybe that would be a Tory interpretation of the history, should take account of those as well. But that's the first, and perhaps in some ways the most famous version of presentism as the Whig interpretation of history, a teleology of ever unfolding progress from the past into the present, and therefore also into the future. The second version of presentism has been particularly tersely defined by the eminent historian on the left here, Lynn Hunt, very eminent historian of the French Revolution, who taught for many, many years at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles in the US, and she was president of the American Historical Association some years ago. And in that capacity, she wrote an article called Against Presentism. And she began that article Against Presentism with the words, "Who isn't against presentism, you say?" Taking it as, again, a bedrock assumption of the historian's creed that one would be against presentism, that any effort to recognize the pressure of the present in reconstructing the past, in directing our questions, in directing the narratives that we tell from our researches, in being shaped by any force in the present. She assumed, and she assumed that other historians would accompany her in assuming, that that kind of presentism was necessarily verboten, taboo among historians. And this is similar to another species of presentism defined by many historians, but particularly by, in one instance, by Gordon Wood, another towering historian of revolution, in this case, the American Revolution, where he talked about it as the present-mindedness that shapes historians' questions and researches. He called it, in fact, flagrant present-mindedness. More recently, Gordon Wood has got himself into quite a lot of hot water as one of the critics of the 1619 Project in the United States for its alleged present-minded distortions of a particular narrative of American history, a more Whiggish, progressive narrative of American history, which Wood and others had made their careers promoting and reconstructing. So that attack on flagrant present-mindedness has often been associated, at least in the US, with a political conservatism with a small c, against a pluralization of history and introducing those darker aspects of the historical record, of elements that might seem non-progressive but nonetheless need to be weighed in the scales of our understanding of how the present was produced by the past. A slightly different species of presentism has been defined by the French classical historian of the classical period, Francois Hartog, in his work, Regimes of Historicity, where he talks about presentism as the shrinkage of our horizons, not just historians' horizons, but the horizons of all of us in late modernity, to contemporary matters alone. A regime of historicity, to use his slightly ungainly term, where the past itself comes to matter less and less. The future becomes increasingly unimaginable and beyond our imaginative control. And we focus entirely upon the present and its particular pressures, something that we might all be feeling in our constricted pandemic moment with particular force, that we're confined within four walls, we're not allowed to roam physically, and in a way, our horizons, our temporal horizons have become constricted. At the same time, we may be all feeling that form of presentism, that shrinkage too, making it day by day, putting one foot in front of another, being fearful of the future and having forgotten the past of which we were part. That kind of presentism, I think, increasingly speaks to us and our strange sense of changing time right now. And this is related to another sense of presentism that historians and others have defined, a sense of the omnipresence of the present in our lives, of the present itself in all of its complexity and danger and confusion, bearing down upon us in such a way that it limits the horizon of our possibilities, that we cannot see beyond the present because the present itself is so utterly pressing in its concerns. Again, something I think we can all intuitively feel at this particular moment of slow motion and seemingly endless crisis and disaster of which we are part. Now, these forms of presentism, again, I've just given you a handful here, are not mutually exclusive, of course, and they sometimes overlap in the way in which historians use that term, almost always to condemn others for their presentism. But it's exceedingly rare. In fact, I can't think of any self-conscious examples at the moment of historians who self-identify as presentist. And so we might say there's a kind of verb declension here. I am a historian and you are present-minded, but they are enemies or professional outsiders. They are presentists and they are the ones to be shunned. But none of us would say as historians, I am a presentist, or very few. I think we should, however, and that's what I want to turn to in the last few minutes of this presentation, and then to open it up to questions. I think we should be embracing presentism. I think as historians, we should be much more self-conscious about those pressures of the present and how they form our horizons for asking questions and for researching them and for talking about them, both in our writing as historians, but in particular in our teaching, in our classrooms and our lectures and our engagements with students like you. And in that positive embrace of presentism, I think we can in some ways go back behind some of the pressures which led to presentism itself being a taboo for historians. I won't go into this here, but I think it's tolerably clear that that those attacks on presentism that I quoted from people like Hunt and Gordon Wood have roots probably pretty deeply in Cold War tensions, the sense that scientific history was something that was not practiced on one side of that ideological divide, and it was necessary to preserve something of the pristine nature of scientific scholarly history against its distortion for ideological purposes. And also for historians of that generation, Hunt and Wood, the ones I quoted are in their 70s and 80s now. For scholars of that generation, there was perhaps some unease among some of those historians at, for example, the rise of social history in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the yoking of historical research to identity politics, particularly, but not exclusively in the US, as causing some discomfort, and a policing of boundaries taking place in that period against what at least some of the more conservative members of the profession saw as an assault on the very citadel of historical research itself. I think we've got past a lot of those anxieties right now, and I think we're also very much in a moment, partly because of the current crisis, partly because of the crisis of racial reckoning under which we're undertaking at this present moment, that now we're much more open to acknowledging that present day concerns not only shape the questions that we ask as historians and as scholars, but indeed to understand those present day concerns, it's utterly essential that we bring our knowledge, our skills, our training, our capacities as scholars to bear upon these concerns, not least because various aspects of recent history have served to occlude aspects of our human relations, our social relations, our economic and political relations, which have been deliberately effaced, sometimes by a misuse or an abuse of history and of the past in recent decades. And it's again our job to go back behind that in a post-truth world to assert the importance of truth and of facticity to recover hidden histories and to uncover the various distorting pressures from the past which have led to some of the problems that we face within the present. So again, important to go back behind that, not to leave history as something that can be safely left in the past and cordoned off from the present, but to break down those barriers, and also again to be open to the possibility that through the use of history, through the excavation and the exploration of the past, we can begin to orient ourselves towards at least some possible and even potentially better, more equitable futures. So historically, what I also want to point out again as I move towards a conclusion and into the discussion portion of this presentation, I think a hostility to presentism in whatever form, with whatever meaning, is actually relatively recent. And if we look in the longer history of history writing, if we look, that is, at the longue durée of history writing, we'll discover quite quickly that this hostility to the present in relation to the past is actually a rather aberrant and unusual attitude among those who have felt it their job to reconstruct the past. In fact, in most traditions of historical writing, for most of human history where there has been self-conscious historical writing, the purpose of reconstructing the past in the present was precisely to determine and to shape action in the future. As Cicero, very frequently quoted in Western historical traditions, right into the at least the 19th century, said history was the magistra vitae, the guide to life itself, that to have knowledge of the past was to use that in the present to point oneself towards the future. This is actual Ciceronian t-shirt, perhaps not worn by the master, but including very, very frequently quoted perception of the importance of history from him. And one could reproduce this from any number of historical traditions, even among the founders of the modern historical profession, or the saints of the modern historical profession. Almost all of the most famous foundational figures themselves believed that history should speak to the present. So Leopold von Ranke in the 19th century, often taken really very much as the founding father and saint of history, the presiding saint of the historical profession, said earlier in his career, would anyone study history at all without the impulse of the present? Benedetto Croce, a great Italian philosopher and historian writing in the 1930s, famously said that all history is contemporary history, and that's often quoted just with a full stop there. But if you go back to his original quotation, he says all history is contemporary history because, however remote in time the events there recounted may seem to be, the history in reality refers to present needs and present situations wherein those events vibrate. That is, we turn to the past as historians or historically minded individuals precisely because there is that vibration, a resonance between the past and the present. That's how we find our way to the past. That's why we look to the past, is precisely because of that impulse of the present, as Ranke put it. And in a more recent text, E.H. Carr's What is History, written in the early 1960s, he wrote there, we can view the past and achieve our understanding of it only through the eyes of the present. History, he wrote, is an unending dialogue between the present and the past. We can sum this up with the words of the American novelist William Faulkner. The past is never dead. It's not even past. It's always with us in the present. And because it's with us in the present, it is there helping us to orient ourselves towards the future. Indeed, as one historian put it, the future has nowhere to come from except from the past. Where else could it come from? And our knowledge of the future is, in fact, rather like our knowledge of the past. It is fragmentary. Our knowledge of the future is fragmentary, just as our knowledge of the past is fragmentary and incomplete. Our reconstruction of the future is tentative, speculative, and always under revision, just like our reconstruction of the past. In fact, just in the same way that historians handle the evidence surviving from the shipwreck of the past, so we can look around us and find evidence for the future. The American science fiction writer William Gibson famously said, as many of you may know, the future is all around us. It's just unevenly distributed. We just need to know where to look for evidence of the future in order to begin piecing together at least plausible or possible scenarios for the future to orient ourselves forward. And I believe, and some other historians are coming to argue, that historians with our skills of reconstructing the past through its fragments, recognizing the gaps, using our tentative and speculative, but also endlessly revising tools, we have, not uniquely among scholars, but particularly skillfully among scholars, we have some of the tools which may allow us to think towards the future using the techniques that we ourselves use as historians to reconstruct the past. Now, if historians isolate ourselves in the past, that is, if we still cling to these bans on presentism, I think we are in danger ultimately of extinction. We may deserve the fate of declining enrollments among our students. This is a table of enrollments in American universities from 2011 to 2017. At the very top right, you can see an expansion of numbers in exercise science, interestingly, and at the very bottom, a decline in numbers of historians. Some of this decline has been arrested in more recent years, even in my own department, where we faced some declines in enrollments. But if historians continue to cut themselves off, if we continue to cut ourselves off from the present and the future, I think we deserve probably to have fewer and fewer students in our own classrooms, and we may even deserve some of the disdain that we get from public figures, including politicians, for the lack of relevance of our own studies. However, if we do accept that all history is a history of the present, shaped by the present, shaped for the present, and shaped in the present, pointing towards the future, if we accept that, I think, and also that the past exists only in our current, contemporary, present-minded construction of it, like those Hawaiian gods in the British Museum, I think then, as historians, we can use our ability, we can use our techniques, we can use our knowledge to reconstruct the past in the present to form a more diverse, a more plural, and ultimately, let us hope, a more equitable future. And only by doing that can we firmly say, in conclusion, that the past has a bright future ahead of it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and indeed responses.
Thank you so much, David. I think that was a brilliant presentation, and it's packed with many, many interesting ideas that I think our audience would be very interested to discuss with you. So yet again, another reminder, we would love to receive your questions for Professor Armitage, and you can submit them in the chat. So perhaps I should start by asking a question myself. So I really enjoyed what you said earlier about how historians can bring our unique capacities and tools to bear upon the concerns of the present day and to co-create more equitable futures. And I was quite curious to see how this would look like, in the context of policy making. And I was wondering what your views are on how a positive embrace of presentism can enhance historians or history's place in public policy making and politics, such as in areas like racial inequalities or climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so very, very important question, one that my co-author and I tackled in the History Manifesto. That came out 5 or 6 years ago now, and we got quite a lot of flack at the time for that. But I think times have changed now, that the last couple of years in particular have seen a greater openness, both among historians on the one side and among those engaged in the formation of public policy on the other side, to being more thoroughly informed by history, and indeed even to sometimes including historians in discussions about reorienting ourselves towards the future. I know that in Oxford, in Britain, as well as in the United States, and almost an emblem of that, the importance of those debates has become the discussion of statues, which ones to leave up, which ones to take down, what might replace them, and what the significance of statuary might be. I think that may not be the single most pressing issue of all, but it's a particularly good one because it has involved historians, activists, politicians, and other public figures in a sometimes acrimonious debate. But it has really cemented the importance of knowing about the past, who put up statues of Confederate generals and why and when and under what circumstances. We now know a great deal more about the ways in which both in the 1920s and 30s and then in the era of the civil rights movement, those statues were put up not as it were, disinterested celebrations of local heroes, but as emblems of racial terror, for instance. And so knowing that past helps us to understand the reasons why we should roll back the darker history, not only of the earlier period being commemorated by those statues, but also of the moment at which they were put up. That's looking back to the past, and having a longer sense of the past, a more complex sense of the past, can help us to make sometimes quite tricky decisions about what to do with the face of the public in terms of public commemoration. But how then to think about the future? How to think about, for example, climate change, as you say. Again, in the last 5 or 10 years, we've had far more historians involved in their own historical work in reconstructing the dimensions of climate change in the past, which in turn has fed into the data and the knowledge that scientists themselves have, climate scientists and others themselves have, about contemporary climate change, where it came from, what may have caused it, how we think about this in relation to anthropocentric causes of climate change and the Anthropocene more generally, as a way then of understanding human responsibility for climate change. If we are responsible for climate change in the past, and we have a stronger knowledge of that through historical research, that in turn opens up new questions of responsibility in the present, in order that we can begin to make decisions in the here and now, which will have very formative effects in the future, informed by that knowledge of the past. So public debate is enriched by that historical knowledge, and increasingly debate in public policy, and the formation of public policy is shaped by that as well. A very heartening development in the US is that the current administration, the Biden administration, not only has a chief scientific advisor now, but has a chief social scientific advisor. Alondra Nelson from Columbia University and the Social Science Research Council has joined the administration as a scholar who, from the side of the social sciences, including history, of course, can now help to inform policy. That's something that many of us have been arguing for, both in the US and in the UK as well. So I think we are turning a corner where the social sciences, including history, are now gaining a place at the table in the formation of public policy, which they should have had for the last 2 or 3 generations, and certainly which they had in other slightly less formalized ways for centuries before that. So again, we're coming out of an anomalous moment where historians were cut off from public policy into one where, along with other human scientists, social scientists, we're now coming back into that broader discussion. I think that has to be a good thing for enriching debate and for shaping possible futures.
Thank you very much, David. I think we have a question from Jamie. Jamie, would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure, yeah, thanks. So my question is to do with kind of making sure that this kind of research goes ahead like in a good way. Thank you very much. I should start by saying this was an absolutely fascinating talk. I was really interested. So I think there are clearly some worries of, those who are against presentists, that this can be taken in a very irresponsible direction. I was wondering if you could briefly sketch kind of the sort of rules or principles which should govern this kind of present focused historical research, so as to like ensure it doesn't become problematic in various different ways, as is warned against by much of the historical discipline up until this moment?
Well, I think it's a very, very good question, Jamie. Thank you. I mean, we have to be very careful about distinguishing between, on the one hand, what I would call irresponsible criticism of historians engaging with present questions, something which can get very politicized. Again, think of Robert Jenrick in the UK, minister, saying we have to protect our statues, we have to have political cordons, as it were, around this revisionist use of history, very much trying to stoke a culture war. It doesn't seem to me, from what I can tell, that's really taken off in the UK, but it's imitating moves that conservatives, again with a small c, were making in the US. I think we ought to be careful about those kinds of critiques from outside the scholarly profession, outside history itself. And then to think also more very much along the lines of your question about how we deal with this within the historical profession itself. So this doesn't mean an abandonment of our protocols for uncovering, curating, assembling, interpreting and narrating evidence. None of those features of what we do as scholars must go by the wayside. Much of this, I think, when you strip away the rhetoric, comes down to the important matter of what we might call question selection. Which questions do we find most important in our historical research? Why do we select those? Why do we put our own individual energies and then, in many cases, our collective energies into focusing on them? Becomes sometimes a dilemma. Time is limited, resources are limited. We're all up against pressures of time and money and attention. And so we have to make those hard decisions about which questions to deal with. But again, it's important not to have that question selection determined from the outside by politicians, for instance. But if this orients us towards, for example, thinking about questions of the origins of racial injustice. Where did those come from? How were structures of white supremacy, for instance, put into place, erected, constructed, continued over time, often very contingently, often very recently? How did that happen? That is an important historical question. And it's an important historical question, not least because I believe, and I've written about this in other contexts, that often we can see that those things which we as humans have invented or constructed, we can uninvent them or deconstruct them or reconstruct them once we know how they were put together and once we see the pressures under which they were put together. So we take our scholarly armory, all of our scientific scholarly protocols, and we bring them to bear upon these current questions in order to uncover the past within the present as a way of orienting ourselves towards the future. I think that is a set of procedures which now increasing parts of the historical profession, increasing proportions of the historical profession is legitimate. And it also sharpens the focus of those historians who may be not working on, I don't know, the British Empire or the 19th century United States, historians outside the most obviously presently relevant fields to say why their question selection matters. And I think that has a salutary effect as well on not just, as it were, unconsciously following the tracks of what your PhD supervisor did and what their ancestors did, but actually all of us being called to account, even just in our own studies, to say, well, why do we study what we study? What are the reasons for that? How have we been formed to ask these questions, to look at these archives, to deal with these particular places or problems? I think that's always a good question to be asking yourself, to be self-conscious about that, even if the answer you come up with isn't necessarily something which is going to solve a present problem. But it's salutary to ask yourself, well, why am I doing this? What am I getting out of this? What am I doing for my students, my readers, the historical profession, the public at large? That's always a good question to ask yourself.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Amelia, and I think that what you've touched on answered the first part of her question, but she has a follow-up question to that. And she would like to know, when and how do we teach this more presentist approach to students of history? So in schools, universities, and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Amelia. That's a wonderful question, and one I think a lot of my fellow historians are facing at the moment. I think even 3 or 4 years ago, there were very, very few, if any, courses anywhere in the world on the history of the present or teaching about the history of the present. So I'm seeing more and more historians who are posting on social media their syllabi for, I'm talking about university classes right at the moment, their syllabi for the history of 2020 or the history of 2021. Again, we've all experienced this compression and confusion of time in the past 12 months or so, where the last year feels like a whole century or a millennium, but has concentrated so many different historical processes together in one moment that unpicking that has become a major task for historians. So I think certainly at the university level, it's becoming even more imperative to think about the different pathways that have got us to the present. How do we think about the interrelations, for example, of globalization with the history of capitalism, with the history of environmentalism? I don't think we can begin to understand the current epidemiological crisis without an understanding of all of those elements feeding into it, for instance. And again, many of my colleagues are beginning to construct courses which do exactly that. How does that confluence of globalization, the easy transmission of viruses through a global system joined together through the airways and other transportation systems, with the invasion of nature, which has led to zoonotic diseases leaping from species to species and now into humans, and how has that been accelerated by the commodification of nature and its circulation through global networks? We can't, again, begin to understand this, and then to bring that together in places like the US and the UK with these questions of racial injustice as well. These are imperative questions for us to be asking in the university context. But you also ask wonderfully, very importantly, about how we might do this in schools, for instance. I think there's often a kind of very productive academic trickle-down effect, if we can use that term, that what gets written about, researched, taught in universities, gradually becomes mainstreamed into teaching in schools as well. And I think that is a very important place to deal with this one unexpected, but I think possibly productive outcome or consequence of our current Zoom room confinement, is that it allows for more contact between scholars of different levels within the universities and within schools, for more cross-fertilization of conversations which normally might take place through the very slow circuits of books being published, then being read, then being turned into textbooks, then being taught in classrooms. Something that could take years now takes minutes or is instantaneous in the kinds of formats that we have now. So I think there are many more opportunities for direct interchanges between scholars in academia and universities and those in schools to ask precisely these questions, which are of course of burning urgency for our students and pupils at every level. So I think that's a wonderful question, one that we as historians, as professional historians, should be thinking a great deal more about how to get these arguments and the results of our discussions of these presentist issues into classrooms and into discussions with students at every level. So thank you for that.
Thank you, David. We have a question from Peter. So Peter, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I found it very interesting. I had a question about like a way you could go about doing history in having a presentist history without having some of the harms. I was going to ask whether you think that it would be possible or advisable to have a strict separation between those who do history and those who use history to make assertions about the present, because I would be worried if you didn't have sort of like a strict distinction there, you'd end up with people not using history to influence how we perceive the present, but just using history to justify our pre-existing thoughts about the present, and it would just embed like a static understanding of the present in itself and become no more significant than, like, well, even worse than normal political arguments, because they wouldn't be based on anything but warped understandings of the past.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely critical point. That's one that I think is perhaps even more critical in the UK and some of the debates there that I've been watching. Absolutely, that sense of being imprisoned within a very specific, very thin national narrative. One often associated with, let's say, I'll age myself here, certain men of my generation who have public positions in politics or in the media, for instance, who were brought up on a diet of World War II movies in their teens, and that's all that they know and all that they care about history, and they associate a particular conception of national identity with a tiny number, not even of facts, but perhaps of half-remembered images from Saturday afternoon television, and associate that with history. No, I think that's you're absolutely right, that that invocation of the past in order to render the present static, I think that's a very good way of thinking about it, is a disaster and something that we must work against. And we work against it not least by precisely turning not from the static, but rather to the dynamic. And I think that's something that we need to insist upon as historians, and more and more public historians are insisting on this, that we, for example, we rebut the charge of revisionism, which comes from those conservative proponents of the past and its static nature. They use the term revisionist in the way that some historians use the word presentism, as a boo word, as a slur, whereas we historians should embrace the idea of revisionism and say, well, that's what we do. We're always provisional and speculative and open-minded in our reconstructions of the past, that as our understandings of what matters in the present, as well as what we rediscover about the past, change, then we change our views of the past and our knowledge of it. That's dynamic, it's energetic, it's often worked out through discussion and and conversation and controversy, and that brings a dynamism not just to the arguments themselves, the conclusions that we produce, but also to the constituencies, the communities, and the people that we bring into those conversations. And it's out of that lively, dynamic, three-dimensional, ever-moving sense of history that we engage a wider audience, and we open up new questions, and I think therefore that we open up new possibilities for thinking about alternative futures. To assume that the past is static and that the present came from that static past is to freeze ourselves into only one possible future, which is distressing and dismaying for those who have not ended up, luckily, through the musical chairs of history in the right places at the moment that it got frozen, but rather we must be thinking about something which is dynamic, open, multiple, plural, and thereby leaves greater possibility for a larger number of people, and historians can definitely contribute to that. So I like very much the way that you frame that. I think you're absolutely right about the danger, and I think as historians we have a responsibility positively to promote this dynamic, open, and plural sense of history as a means towards thinking about multiple futures out of multiple pasts. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, I'm afraid that we only have 2 more questions in the chat, and we'll call it a day. So we have another question as a follow-up to what Amelia asked earlier, and it is, which methodology should history use to include presentism in its approach?
Should we take the second question as well? Just bundle them together, perhaps?
Yep, of course. So the second question would be, does moral judgment have any place in presentism, and if so, where?
Ah, great. Those two go together nicely, I think. Normally, when we ask questions about methodology, we think of that in terms which doesn't have an ethical or a moral content. For instance, that methodology is something antiseptic, something that is scientific in the sense of being disinterested, that is detached from our own commitments, in particular our ethical commitments, and that a methodological question question is usually one about how do we handle documents, how do we interpret the traces of the past in quite technical ways. I'm sure that's not the way it was meant as it was asked here, but I think putting those two questions together about moral judgment, the ethical responsibility of the historian, and methodology is particularly important at this moment to reinvigorate our sense of how the past can speak to the present. So a methodology which is open to the ethical implications of what we do. I've argued elsewhere that historians in the recent past have, when they have thought about the ethical implications, the moral judgments that are implied in history, when they've thought about that at all, they have tended to say, we do have an ethical responsibility as historians, but our ethical responsibility is solely to the past. That is solely to reconstructing the past in its own terms, in its distance and its strangeness, and that therefore we don't have an ethical responsibility to the present or indeed to the future. And that therefore any moral judgments that we make are moral judgments about our methodology, precisely shrinking that horizon to how we reconstruct the past, and not thinking about our ethical responsibilities in the present, and not also articulating our ethical responsibilities in the present to our understanding of the moral judgments that people made in the past. Now, and this is obviously a very pointed question. If we go back, for instance, again to the question of public statuary, for instance, in Oxford or in Oxford, in our Zoom rooms concentrated in Oxford, we might all be thinking about the very immediate debate this week, even about the Rhodes statue at Oriel College. And one response to the defenders of keeping the Rhodes statue in place as it is at the moment, when they make the argument, for instance, well, to tear down the statue of someone like Rhodes is to use only present moral judgments on the past, it's to fail to understand the past and its own judgments. That is a failure of history. That's a failure of historical understanding. Even the most minimal understanding of debate over the ethical implications of empire in the early 20th century in Britain and beyond leads one to see immediately there were ferocious ethical debates about empire itself. There was no universal consensus behind the British Empire and British imperialism, and least of all was there consensus about Rhodes himself. Even other imperialists, even some of the people we might now condemn using our own moral judgments in the late 19th or early 20th century, even they condemned Rhodes as a monster in the context of empire. So historical reconstruction of moral judgments, even in the past, often leads us to conclusions which are quite similar to our own moral judgments in the present. And that convergence, that conjunction is something which I think can be particularly powerful in the present as well. So there's no necessity of assuming that there's a gulf between past and present moral judgment. Those can often converge. We do have an ethical responsibility as historians, of course, to reconstruct the past in its own particularity and specificity, but we also have an ethical responsibility to the present, to inform people in the present about where that present came from. And I think also coming back to the theme, the question that was asked as the overarching topic for this discussion, I think we have an ethical responsibility to use our knowledge as historians in the present to think about possible futures based upon that knowledge of all of the potential and actual pasts of which we are aware. So I think that might be a reasonable note on which to wrap up this part of the discussion, but I hope it will continue among yourselves. And if any of you would like to carry on this discussion by contacting me, I'd be very happy to do that as well. So thank you so much all for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. That concludes our Q&A segment, and I would like to thank our audience firstly for asking really thoughtful questions that definitely enriched our discussion. And we also can't thank Professor Armitage enough for gracing our event today and sharing his wonderful insights with us. So as David said earlier about continuing this discussion, I'm very pleased to let you know that we'll be revealing another roundtable discussion on the same theme with another 3 prominent historians this Friday on the 12th of February, who will be weighing in on the topic from the the perspectives of their own research background. And unfortunately, we can't hold the event live because the speakers reside in Singapore, Australia, and the US, and the time differences just make it so that it's better to have it pre-recorded and uploaded on our social media platforms. So please check that out when that's uploaded, and just stay in touch. And yeah, we hope to see you at future events. Thank you so much for your attending the talk today. Thank you, David, as well.
Thank you, Callista. Thank you all. Wonderful questions. Great to see you. Hope to see some of you in Oxford sometime.
Thank you.
Goodbye.